Thank you for having me to Sydney. Thank you for providing me with this opportunity. We had a great afternoon yesterday, and if I were to just ask how many here have read anything on the Roswell incident of 1947? How many here believe they've heard everything that's generally known about the Roswell incident of 1947?
Generally not.
Is there anyone here this evening who legitimately would say that they're skeptical on the incident? No one. Oh, it's a shame. Because what we did yesterday was mostly presenting the case as we would in a courtroom. In other words, the opening remarks, and then the evidentiary, and then we didn't really have a closing statement of any sort. But nonetheless, we presented as much of the hard evidence, the anecdotal, circumstantial evidence, and we all have to concede, we'd have to admit that many a person has faced capital punishment with nothing more than a single witness saying, "I saw you do it." And if we were to ask, what is 100% of recorded history based on? It's eyewitness testimony. And I'd like to believe that it's isolated in the sense that over in the States, they're trying to destroy the very concept that there's no such thing as a reliable witness on anything. In other words, all history needs to be revised. All eyewitness testimony needs to be rewritten. There are no heroes. There are no, as far as winners. We have to essentially continue to create a level playing field so we don't offend anyone, so we don't lower anyone's self-esteem. And Roswell is a principal example of where a government resorted to the most extreme measures to essentially deprive people not only of their First Amendment rights, the freedom of speech, but secondly, that if that wasn't enough, they had to draw their families into the equation. They had to threaten their children, their wives. In a country where the military has absolutely no authority over civilians unless martial law is declared. And I think that's one of the unique things about Roswell, and it's really the only UFO case in the world where it can be demonstrated that the government went out of its way. It resorted to, as I said, extreme measures to silence witnesses to what they to this day still claim is nothing more than a weather balloon. Now just imagine, after 72 years, they're still going out of their way to make sure people don't hear the truth about a weather balloon. And when I consider the level of witnesses, up to 3-star generals, judges, politicians, entertainers, TV stars, and some of the most highly trained, experienced people in the military, and how they were essentially reduced down to the point that their credibility was in question, their reputations were smeared, and they were made to feel totally hopeless in the face of government reprisal, again over a weather balloon. Now I mentioned the judge, and I'll mention specifically the late Judge Bud Payne. Back in 1947, he was the son of one of the ranch hands on one of the adjoining ranches where this took place. And so he was just going about his routine responsibilities, his chores, and a cow had strayed from their ranch and got onto the wrong ranch. And he made an effort to retrieve and bring it back. And all at once, an Army Jeep comes roaring out of nowhere. And two security officers, they jump out and they physically manhandle him. They practically throw him over the fence and say, "Don't you ever come back on this ranch again." First of all, they were the violators. They were the trespassers. He had no idea what had transpired, what was going on the base, until years later, when the very rancher who got in the most trouble for just doing his civic duty by reporting what he had discovered. And he showed him where it all happened. He took him out to the site and he became one of our principal witnesses in identifying the very location. And that was in January of 1990. It was a cold and blustery day. It was barely freezing, temperature-wise. And we sat in back of his pickup truck as his son and he, and all we said was, "Just drive, take us. We're not going to lead you in any way. Show us where the rancher told you back in the 1950s where this all happened." And he took us to the exact same location. Well, anyway, we became friends. And he would say, "Don, I'm going to make you a clock. I make these clocks that the numerals are of turquoise stone. And then I use rattlesnake ribs as far as to also decorate the wooden clock. And on its face, I use trinidite. Well, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? Trinity Site. So where the ground had turned to glass from the blast, that's called trinidite. So he uses some of that material for the face of his clocks. And so something unique, something that I couldn't wait to get what he had promised me. So a year would pass, and every time I would see him, he'd go, "Don, I still owe you the clock." Another year passes. "I'm working on it. You're going to get your clock." So finally, it was when we were doing the research for the Roswell movie. And originally, we were to be produced by HBO, home box office. We eventually wound up with Showtime, but originally HBO. And so they hired a researcher by the name of John Adam, who wrote for Spy magazine out of New York, and he also was a stringer for Time magazine. So he accompanied us to New Mexico. He wanted to meet witnesses. His assignment was to actually talk to the first-hand people involved, get a grasp of what type of story we're dealing with here. And one of the people we introduced him to was Judge Bud Payne. And this was in the town of Lincoln. Any of you who are into history, who know anything about Billy the Kid, Lincoln County range wars after the Civil War, Billy the Kid breaking out of jail, Pat Garrett, and then later killing him. That's all in that town, that area. Lincoln, New Mexico, about an hour west of Roswell. And we felt at one point we were going to ditch John Adam. We were going to go visit the very son of the rancher and meet with him privately because we had some other things to discuss. Well, meanwhile, John Adam is still staying at the Wortley Hotel that Marshal Pat Garrett had owned back at the time of Billy the Kid. He started the hotel. And Judge Payne was looking for me, and he goes, "Where's Don? I have his clock." So, first, it was just amazing the way the rest of it happened, because we're sitting at the ranch house of Bill Brazel. And all at once, there's a knock at the door. Now, mind you, this is out in the open range, as far as separate individual ranches. Some of you might remember Sam Donaldson from ABC News. Donaldson owns one of the neighboring ranches in that area. Ted Turner, when he was still married to Jane Fonda, they bought up much of the ranch land surrounding that area, and they were raising buffalo, bison. So there's a knock at Bill Brazel's door, Sunday afternoon. We're sitting there with Bill. His wife Shirley goes to the door, and she kind of does a look at us like, does somebody know you're here? And in steps John Adam. And he's holding something. And he comes walking in, and we introduce him, and he places it down on the table. And I'm looking at it affectionately because there's my clock. And as we would finish up over the next hour, and I'm just about ready to take my clock, Bill Brazel leans forward and he goes, "Boys, I just want to thank you for bringing me this beautiful clock."
Oh, no. No.
And I'm looking at John Adam like, why did you even show up? And then I couldn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I had a clock, but I lost my clock. Now that was in 1993. So we're talking 26 years ago. So when Bill died 6 years later, his son, Joe, immediately calls up and says, "Don, I think we have something of yours." And I go, "My clock!" And he says, "Next time you're here, you take your clock." And so I did get my clock back in 2002, 6 years later. And then I thought, well, it probably would be more fitting because Bill had just passed away. Bud Payne, Judge Payne, had also just passed away. So I felt, what better place than to donate it to our museum in Roswell. I'm one of the co-founders. And there it would hang with a little plaque that read, "Donated by Judge Bud Payne, William Brazel, and Donald R. Schmidt." So a few months ago, I'm down at the museum, and we've been working on all these new displays. And I go, "Where's my clock?" "Oh, it's not going to fit into the new scheme of displays, so we put it in the storage room." I want my clock. They shipped my clock to me. It's hanging now in my office, and after 26 years, I finally have my clock. So you see that I could describe so many other wonderful stories, especially concerning the witnesses, because not a one of them ever tried to capitalize on this. Not a one of them wrote a book. Even when we started the museum, it was only that we approached a number of these individuals, because I don't live in New Mexico. I'm 1,000 miles away in Wisconsin. So we needed, as far as local representation. And so we had the late Walter Hott, who was the public information officer at the base in 1947. And we had Glenn Dennis, who was the mortician who was involved with this at the time, that they needed the child-sized caskets when the calls came. Let's imagine, you're an embalmer, you're a mortician, and you get a phone call as to the availability of child-sized caskets. And your first reaction is, "Oh my God, was there an accident involving children?" And they say, "No, we would just like to have some on standby if we ever need them." Well, this is a military base. But we'll be getting into that in a little bit. But you've all seen this internationally famous banner headline, correct? And the press release that went out at the time. United States, Roswell Army Airfield, announcing to the world they had actually captured a flying saucer. The problem is 5 hours later, Washington intervenes and says, no, you didn't. It's nothing more than a weather balloon with a radar reflector kite. The men who were in charge of the atomic bomb, the first atomic bomb squadron in the world, the 509th Bomb Group, they couldn't recognize a neoprene rubber balloon, a radar reflector kite, a foil, sticks, string, and tape. Off-the-shelf material a 5-year-old child would have had no trouble identifying. And yet, the people in charge of the atomic bomb, they somehow were confused. Now, our government, back in the States, still wants the world to believe that. And in fact, as we'll be getting into some of the minutiae of events concerning the cover-up and what transpired even up to today. Presidents, senators, congressmen, governors, all making efforts to try to determine what had actually happened. And as of today, November 3rd, 2019, no one has succeeded. Except I can just imagine the powers that be kind of sliding their hands together and going, the last witness just passed away, cover up complete. Because for them it was nothing more than stalling for time, running out the clock until the last one was gone. They were so keen on coming up with explanations for Roswell that even in recent times, authors such as Annie Jacobsen, who wrote the book Area 51, based on a lone witness who was exposed and discredited, claimed that what actually crashed in the heart of New Mexico was a Horton Brother flying wing that the Soviets had captured at the fall of Berlin, the end of World War II, and that Dr. Death, Joseph Mengele, had taken a number of 13-year-old children and mutated them into looking like aliens, crashed it in the high desert of New Mexico to try to panic the United States into believing we were invaded. Now, I'm talking about a theory just within the last 5 years. And who wrote up all the press accounts, Time Magazine, New York Times? That explains Roswell, they were all saying. Now, it didn't matter that Joseph Mengele was not captured by the Russians. In fact, he lived out the rest of his life in Argentina. It's a matter of historic fact. Doesn't matter that the Horton brothers never got one of their flying wings into the air. They had prototypes. And the only one that was recovered is presently at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, and it's a tubular bicycle frame and varnished wood. Hardly airworthy, and I could hardly imagine it could fly from Russia all the way to New Mexico with a crew of 13-year-olds. I asked Annie Jacobsen, which 13-year-old was even flying? Doesn't matter, because I have my source. My source. Well, I've talked to over 600 witnesses, directly or indirectly involved. Yeah, but I have my one witness. And then when ABC Nightline found out who he really was, and his excuse was, well, I was just trying to help her sell books. So you see, and I pointed out the shenanigans we have to constantly deal with, the disinformation, and the willing accomplices in the American media. Yesterday we talked about the late doctor / Apollo astronaut, Apollo 14, who walked on the moon, Edgar Mitchell. And when he came forward because he was in high school back in 47 when this happened. He knew many of the officers who were involved and then stayed in contact with them, and many of them confided to him throughout the rest of their lives about what really happened. And yet when Mitchell stepped forward, NASA immediately discredited him. Well, maybe he was in space too long. And you know what happens once men reach that golden age where you can't believe or trust anything they say. The foreign press loved it. They treated him with all the respect that was due him. But once again, heroes in America are always expendable. They're only useful long enough to, as far as perform their duty, and then after that, we have to make sure that no lobster crawls out of the pot because, we got to always pull them back down. Why do you think in American media, American entertainment right now, comic book heroes are the rage? Because it's fiction. And even there, we have to show that they're fallible, that they can die. Iron Man in the last movie, Iron Man dies. Oh, I hope I didn't give anything away. I'm sorry. Oh, I didn't mean to. So at times I'm going to lecture a little, just like a college professor. Because again, this isn't what I've read, this is what I've lived. I've been there. I've been to New Mexico over 150 times. We've had 5 archaeological digs at the crash site, which I've supervised and led. We've tracked down, as I mentioned, over 600 witnesses. And we're still hunting for what we call our Holy Grail, the piece of physical evidence that will once and for all prove this as the real thing. Now, how many know exactly when we talk about the actual wreckage at Roswell? Do you have an idea what we're talking about? Yeah. Paper thin, metal like. The witnesses always qualified the fact that it was metal, but it really wasn't metal. It was plastic-like, but it really wasn't plastic. Because they couldn't get over the fact that it was so light. It was practically weightless in your hands. And you couldn't cut it. You couldn't burn it. Even a bullet wouldn't penetrate it. Major Jesse Marcel described that the engineers back at the base, they took a larger piece of it, about 4 feet in diameter, and they took a 16-pound sledgehammer, and they pounded on it over and over again, and it would just bounce off. Paper-thin material, and they couldn't even scratch it. Next time you're in a hardware store, pick up a 16-pound sledgehammer. Just pick it up. It'll go through your car like tissue paper. And this stuff, it wouldn't even scratch. There were I-beam sections of the same material with strange symbols that ran the length of each structure, each piece, like nobody had ever seen before. They would say it was hieroglyphic-like, but again, nobody had ever seen these symbols before. There were silken strands of material like microfilament fishing line. You could hold a light up to one end, and the light would emit out the opposing end. Well, they're describing fiber optics. In 1947, yet fiber optics weren't developed until around 1970. And then the most amazing material of all that we still are hunting for more than anything else, our Holy Grail, as I said. The same nearly indestructible material. You couldn't cut, you couldn't burn. Bullet wouldn't penetrate. But this you could crumble up. You could crease, you could fold. You could crunch into a ball, and every time you'd release your grip and you'd lay it down onto a surface, it would flow like water. It would just smooth right out, right before your eyes. In other words, it possessed perfect memory. We don't even have such material today. And yet this is exactly what all the witnesses who actually handled, who witnessed, who had that opportunity to truly see something extraordinary have described to us during all these years of investigation. So that will serve as a basis And I want you then, as we continue for the next few hours, does this sound like a weather balloon? Does this sound like neoprene rubber, reflective foil? Does this sound like an airplane? Does this sound like a rocket? Does this sound like anything prosaic, anything conventional? Or again, is it truly something extraordinary, as all the witnesses have stated right up to their very deathbeds? That's the radar kite. And I talked about this yesterday, that immediately after Roswell, and they had explained it away as being nothing more than the neoprene rubber balloon, and then they reflected the hexagonal foil kite, the frame of wooden sticks, tape, and string. Is anybody sitting here this evening having a hard time identifying that? Does anybody here believe that's a flying saucer? And yet, immediately after the incident, they put on these public demonstrations all over America, trying to drive home their point that not only does this explain away Roswell, but all the flying saucer, all the flying disc reports at that time. Now, mind you, the very term UFO wasn't even coined yet for another 5 years. If you go back, any one of you can go to your public libraries, your university libraries, and pull out all the old microfilm, the microfiche, all the digitized newspapers, and you will see that entire summer, middle of June through the middle of July of '47. It was as though America was being invaded. Banner headline after headline about the flying saucers, the flying discs. So now they had an opportunity to discredit all of it. That they were nothing more than weather balloon devices. So they would launch the balloons. And once they would reach a certain altitude, and the air would compress them, and they would become elliptoid, and they would reflect the sun. And they'd go, you see how you could mistake that for being something minus wings and a tail section? That is what people are reporting all over America. Here are your flying saucers, nothing more than balloons. And not a single reporter who ever witnessed any of these demonstrations asked, yes, but what about when it's on the ground in front of you and you can actually pick it up? Because that's what happened at Roswell. There's the disconnect. That's where, again, the press, as much as you'd like to believe they were our public watchdogs, always protecting us and looking out for our best interests. And more times than not, they get along to get along. They go along to get along. And certainly is the case in America. Has anyone here not seen this picture? And that was Jesse Marcel, Major Jesse Marcel. He would retire lieutenant colonel. Again, does anybody have any problem identifying this? Looks pretty flimsy on top of it. Think it would withstand a 16-pound sledgehammer? How about a bullet? Right there is the rotted neoprene rubber of the balloon. We even have witnesses, the people who wrapped it up in the brown, you see the brown wrapping paper there? Sergeant Robert Porter of the 715th Bomb Squadron at Roswell. And they wrapped up the remnants of the balloon, because guess where they were launching the balloons in question here? At the base at Roswell. They were more familiar with these balloons than anyone, because when they were conducting their atomic bomb exercises, and they didn't have the actual bomb casings, so what they were doing is they were using the equivalent in a sand barrel as far as size and weight. But nonetheless, the very balloons that provided them with the upper level wind velocity, wind direction, It provided them as far as with their radar reflector kites. The information they needed. Now, Porter even described to us that one of the packages was about 3.5 feet triangular in shape. There's the brown. So when I'm asked, where did the weather balloon come from? It came from Roswell. And not because that's what they discovered at the crash site, but because they were at this point now going to do the old switch. In fact, the base commander at Roswell was Colonel William Blanchard. His superior officer, his boss, was Brigadier General Roger Ramey. Ramey's chief of staff was Colonel Thomas DuBose. When DuBose was retired, he was a one-star Brigadier General. We have a signed sworn affidavit from DuBose before he died. In other words, it's admissible in a court of law, sworn affidavit stating they were the ones who switched this for the real material. His statement was, the balloon was a hoax. And Major Marcel was ordered to pose with the balloon before. He was ordered by Ramey out of the office before the press were allowed in. And he was told not to say another word to any of the press. And then, instead of being allowed to go back to Roswell, because this isn't in Roswell, how many thought that the balloon press conference was in Roswell? It was going up the chain of command. It was over in Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth, Texas. It's where Ramey had his office. So they diverted all attention away from Roswell. Major Marcel, who's the only one mentioned in the press release where they announced they had captured a flying saucer, and Major Jesse Marcel, head of intelligence, is at this time flying the actual wreckage to higher headquarters. Well, General Ramey at Fort Worth is higher headquarters. So Marcel is out of the picture. He's not in Roswell any longer. The rancher who brought the material in, he's been abducted by the military and held for 5 days. The base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, he announces he's going on leave, when in reality he sets up operation out at the crash site. So all the key players are now all unavailable. No one's left to answer any questions. And then they keep Marcel overnight in Fort Worth. He doesn't fly back to Roswell until the next evening. Again, keep him incognito, out of the picture, away from anybody who might be able to question. And they also swear him to secrecy. He is not able, in fact, when he does arrive home, first words he says to his wife and his son is, I cannot say another word about this. I'm sworn to secrecy. Now, nowadays, people might think, well, that doesn't mean much. Believe me, World War II, post-World War II, the zeitgeist of the time was when you took an oath, you kept it. And many of the people, throughout the military have long histories of never divulging anything to their families, their loved ones. I mean, there are countless examples of men and women who have taken everything to their graves with them. So, I mean, it's a wonderful testimony as far as people that can keep secrets. And Marcel was certainly one of them, at least for the next 30 years. You notice the general is holding a piece of paper. How many here have heard of the Ramey memo? We'll be going into a little more detail on that in a little bit, but I don't want to have to come all the way back to it. But General Ramey was photographed in 4 separate shots. 2 of them are with his aide, Colonel DuBose. In all 4, he's holding that telex. In 3 of the shots, now, if you were an investigator, I want you to think of this for a moment. In 3 of the shots, the back of the paper, the blank side of the telex, is facing the camera. In only 1 is a portion of text visible. So, what do we surmise might have happened? That in the very first picture, the text was facing the camera, and he got caught, and he noticed, and he flipped it around for the next 3? Is that a possibility? Because that's exactly what happened. He realized what he was holding. And then again, in the subsequent 3 pictures, which were taken by a reporter by the name of James Bond Johnson from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And so even back then, Ramey was acting as though it was a confidential piece of information. So we're going to be coming back to this. And so I just wanted to give a little heads up on that. So, next morning, General Ramey empties Roswell saucer. Banner headline, the Roswell Daily Record. Flying disc turns up as just hot air. Army knocks down disc. It's a weather balloon. Army finds air saucer and ranch. And see, disc goes to high officers. This is all a matter of historic fact, ladies and gentlemen. All of this. And if you were to ask, then where did the wreckage go? Because originally, Major Marcel, when he left the base at Roswell, do we know what his final destination was? Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, which was the Area 51 of that time. It had Foreign Technology Division. It was originally called T2. All the captured armory, weaponry, all the aircraft from Germany, Japan, even Russia. In other words, if America would get their hands on a Russian MiG, it always went to Foreign Technology Division at Wright Field, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So please believe me, Area 51, again, is just a smokescreen. It has nothing to do with UFOs, and certainly has nothing to do with state-of-the-art technology regarding American aircraft, at least at this time. So again, one of the weather balloon demonstrations. Number of the arbiters of the cover-up. That large, hulking man standing to your far left, that's the Roswell base commander, Colonel William Blanchard. And you see next to him, General Ramey. And then there's General Clements McMullen and Stuart Symington as far as Secretary of War. This was a picture taken at Roswell within weeks of the incident. Again, people who were personally involved with the cover-up. General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, Secretary of the Air Force at that time, one of the key arbiters of the cover-up. And what Vandenberg was especially concerned about was panic. Because what had just transpired 9 years before? The Orson Welles broadcast, The War of the Worlds. It was very fresh in their memories at that time. Yeah. And they didn't want the actual panic to ensue. In fact, Vandenberg kept bringing up, if we tell the truth, who knows what the people will do. This is Marcel again. As I said, he would retire a lieutenant colonel. And he left the military just a year later. Front entrance, of the base at that time, 1947. It's an overview of the base itself. You see the B-29s. They flew the atomic bombs. In fact, the two bombers that ended World War II over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were Enola Gay and Boxcar. Colonel Blanchard was actually to have been the pilot of Boxcar that destroyed Nagasaki. But they had bigger plans for Blanchard. They were schooling him. You would think the base commander at Roswell at that time, who made such a blunder that they misidentified a weather balloon and had the whole country alarmed that we had a captured flying saucer. You'd think he'd be reprimanded. You'd think that he would have been essentially given his pink slip and said, you know, why don't you take an early retirement, Colonel? He went on to become a 4-star general by the age of 50. Unheard of. But as I said, that's why they removed him from the second flight over Japan, because he was one of their boys. He was their golden child, so to speak. And the military put him on a fast track to go all the way to the Pentagon as he did. And he died at his desk at the Pentagon at the age of 50.
Oh, 50.
Artist's conception of the debris field. Debris that covered an area of almost a mile long. In God's name, what type of balloon would extend for almost a mile? Not even a Goodyear blimp. You see the plainclothes gentleman. Oh, excuse me. You recall that there was a counterintelligence officer who went with Marcel, as ordered by Colonel Blanchard. Now again, I want you to just think on this for a moment. The base commander, some rancher, some cowboy, brings in some strange material. And normally, especially in the face that nothing has been reported missing, it's a 4th of July weekend. It's the American Independence Day weekend. Most of the men are home on leave. Nothing is being tested. Nothing has gone off course. Nothing is being looked for. There isn't a search being conducted for anything. And the point being, if it isn't ours, then whose is it? And so Colonel Blanchard just doesn't send a couple of enlisted men, a couple of grunts to go investigate it. He sends his two head of intelligence, Major Marcel, and counterintelligence, Captain Sheridan Cabot, in the event it's something foreign. Point being, they can't identify it. As Jamie showed at the beginning of the introduction, this was the first book on Roswell. Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore. And the quote, Bill Moore, it was a disgraceful hodgepodge of fact and fiction. Because they were just getting started. There was just so much that they had to learn. And they rushed the book out. And with minimal fanfare, very little media coverage. And it wasn't until our first book came out in April of 1991 that the media just literally exploded around the world on Roswell. We did everything from Oprah to Good Morning America, Today Show, Larry King Live, CBS 48 Hours, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw on NBC. We were just besieged over, and we loved it because it was great that finally someone was paying attention to what all these witnesses have been trying to alert America and the world to after all these years. That's the cover of the first book. We hated, that's a spinning top. That's contacting Dan Fry from New Mexico, and that's all that is. And in fact, we couldn't get our publisher, Avon, to even change the picture. Well, the reason they used it was because they had the rights to it. So it was, they're getting their money back for having purchased the rights. Now we become a little more contemporary. Secretary of the Air Force, Sheila Windhall. 1994. Colonel Richard Weaver at the Pentagon. In September of that year, they called a press conference at the Pentagon. And Colonel Weaver admits that they lied about the original balloon explanation. And they came out with a new theory that what actually crashed back in 1947 was a top secret balloon project called Mogul, Project Mogul. I can't emphasize enough, it's the same balloon, but it was a Russian spy balloon at that time, because the one thing that was different was it had an acoustic listening device suspended beneath it, a microphone. And what Colonel Weaver was trying to convince the entire room of reporters was the personnel at Roswell in charge of the atomic bomb saw that microphone and thought, oh my God, it must be from outer space. And the reporters were laughing. But he went on that we have the documents. We can place it actually there. Well, that was a bald-faced lie, because they have, to this day, 0 witnesses. There is not a single witness who can place that or any other conventional device at the crash site. Nothing. And so, in describing this special project, all to detect when the Soviet Union would detonate their own first atomic bomb, it failed miserably. In fact, in August of '49, when they did explode their first bomb, Mogul failed. The theory being that we would pick up the shock wave in the upper atmosphere. Well, we determined it weeks later because of increased radiation in Eastern Europe. So the balloon project, again, for being top secret, was a failure. There's no reason to be concerned about it remaining secret. And so it was discontinued. They even stopped as far as launching the balloons after 1949. So getting back to the Secretary of the Air Force, Sheila Windhall. She put out a statement absolving, at that time, all Air Force personnel of their security oaths concerning Roswell. Now, again, historically, I'd like you to think, if you know anything about American history, what is wrong with that? She absolves all Air Force personnel from 1947 of their security oaths concerning Roswell. There was no Air Force in 1947. This was an Army incident. The United States Air Force didn't split away from the Army until January of 1948. It was a red herring. In other words, let's see if the press buy it. And they did. Not a one picked up on that fact. Not a one. So then, when we actually went to witnesses, thinking, well, maybe they'll fall for the same, ploy initiated by the Air Force, they were all, one by one, saying, when can the Air Force absolve me of a security oath when I was Army? And that's the point. One branch cannot do that for another branch. Sorry, it has never happened and it will never happen. So it was just wonderful to have our witnesses one by one say, sorry, I was Army. We were Army. Roswell Army Airfield, 1947, not Roswell Air Force Base. In fact, in January, Roswell became Walker Field, Walker Air Force Base. But again, this is 6 months after the Roswell crash took place. They came out with their 700-page report on Project Mogul. 700 pages, trying to once again reinvent the wheel. Don't pay any attention to the witnesses. We'll tell you what really happened. This was the actual book itself, the Roswell Report. Project Mogul. Again, does anybody have a hard time identifying that? I mean, I'm sorry, maybe someone here, and then I'll go, well, then I guess that could have happened. But the thought being that anyone would misidentify that as something manufactured off the planet by a higher intelligence. You know when the actual balloon with the radar reflector kites actually was developed? 1927. Many years before radar, because then they just used fabric kites, and they'd use field glasses, and they would just watch. And then with the advent of radar, that's when they started using reflective foil. So, again, for 20 years they were using these balloons. And the thought that all at once they'd misidentified for being something as far as extraordinary as you could possibly imagine, a flying saucer. There's a full Mogul balloon train. You see up at the very top some of the balloons and then all the kites. We talked about Captain Sheridan Cabot, retired Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Cabot of the Counterintelligence Corps. We met with him a half a dozen times. Each time we met with him, he tried to convince us he wasn't even at Roswell in 1947. And each time we would provide more documentation, well, but then nothing happened. I didn't see anything. Well, you have witnesses. We have witnesses who say you were out at the debris field. They don't know what they're talking about. I wasn't there. Last time we were with Colonel Cabot, we're walking out to the car, and all at once his wife, Mary, yells out, "Tell the boys about the colonel from the Pentagon who was just here to interview you about 1947. And it was Colonel Richard Weaver of the Pentagon, who I just mentioned, who had the press conference announcing that it was just Project Mogul. And he gives her a look like, shut up, lady, don't say another word. And then he snaps back at us and he goes, yeah, and I told him exactly as I'm telling you. I wasn't there. Well, then when you read the Project Mogul report, who's their star witness? Colonel Cabot, saying I was trying to convince Jesse Marcel it was nothing but a Mogul balloon, and then Colonel Blanchard kept trying to tell me not to say anything because I was telling them I knew exactly what it was. And he lied to Colonel Weaver about the whole affair, just as he had lied to us. And yet when he was dying, a year later, his son Joe, a practicing attorney, tried to get him to write a final statement. In fact, the picture was there, it's a different program, but his boss was Colonel Doyle Reese. Cabot is down at Roswell, and Doyle Reese is at Kirtland up in Albuquerque, 200 miles to the north. Reese sent a letter to Cabot before he died. When you call your press conference to tell the world, I want to be there. In other words, your press conference about Roswell. So his son Joe tries him to get him to write one final statement. And all his father would say is, "It was just a mogul balloon. Didn't I say so? Didn't I tell everyone that?" And his father would just say, "I'm not ready. I'm not ready." And then, when I spoke to his personal physician after he passed away, and she said it was the saddest thing to see him sitting in a chair next to his hospital bed, and the family all gathered, reminiscing, sharing stories, and he just sat there not saying a word, as though he was even then afraid to say something, afraid he might say the wrong thing. As though, and she put it this way, as though he was still under someone else's control. And I'm doing all this because, and you see we're kind of jumping back and forth, 1947, contemporary, 1947, 1992, and so on. This was in 2001. This is Mac Brazel's daughter, Mac Brazel being the very rancher who discovered the wreckage. His sister, or I should say Bill Brazel's, who took my clock away from me the first time, his sister, Bessie Brazel Schreiber. Bessie was also contacted by the Air Force for their Project Mogul report. They talked her into claiming that she was there with her father at the time, and all they gathered up was a balloon. And before she died, she confessed that they forced her into saying that. In fact, her husband, Robert, told us that right after my partner, Tom Carey, and myself, we left meeting with her in Portland, Oregon, that she said to her husband, "Why did I mislead them? Am I that afraid of the Air Force still that I couldn't tell them the truth? That I wasn't even there. I was not even on the ranch at that time." There's her father, Mac. You've all seen this picture in the books and elsewhere. Harassed rancher who located saucer. This was the day the balloon story came out. This was the bottom article of the front page. So he told about it. In fact, he also adds that if I find something less than a bomb, I'm not going to say a word at all next time. Because, and we talked about this yesterday, where was Brazel at this time? He was abducted. He was in custody of the United States Army for 5 full days. They kept him up all hours of the night, asking him the same questions over and over again. They didn't feed him. They subjected him to a full body cavity search, looking for pieces of a weather balloon, I assume. And then in 1997, just before the 50th anniversary, they came out with their 4th explanation. The anthropomorphic wooden crash dummy, Project High Dive, Project Excelsior. That what the witnesses at Roswell mistakenly reported as bodies, non-human bodies, were actually wooden crash dummies. Again, I'm sad to say this is my own country's Air Force. But then again, they've been lying and deceiving the world about this for 72 years. And I would like to believe, and we've been hearing about the Navy and the situation like with the Nimitz and the pilots that are coming forward and the gun camera footage. And I had one of the pilots say, it's because we're getting damn tired of the Air Force lying and drawing us in, and we're now going to start describing what we're experiencing. So if that is true, finally, because, again, there was no Air Force in 1947. They even pushed the Army out of the way. They took charge. And so they came out with the 4th explanation. Now we all know that the bodies recovered at Roswell were generally described as being about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. Larger disproportionate heads, spindly bodies, a silver one-piece jumpsuit covering their bodies. The wooden crash dummies were all 6 feet tall. And when I say anthropomorphic, it's because they're hinged. In other words, to resemble as far as the joints in the human body. Project High Dive and Excelsior were testing high-altitude breathing equipment because the first times they tried it with human beings, they got frozen. They had frostbite on their hands, their feet. So they replaced them with, obviously, something artificial. The very designer of the crash dummies, I spoke with him before he died, and he was livid. In fact, he sent a threatening letter to the Pentagon saying, "How dare you tarnish my reputation, because you know that this could not have been responsible. In fact, you know for a fact that these bodies, when they would strike the ground, they would break up in pieces. An arm here, a leg here, the head over there." And the projects didn't originate until 1952, 5 years after Roswell. So how do you plug in? How do you put the two together? Well, they came up with a new medical malady called time compression. The spokesperson of the Pentagon is standing there and he's describing that, well, we don't know for a fact that this happens, but we are going to theorize that as people get older, not only do they start to confuse the years, but also the decades. No such condition. You will not find it in a single medical book or journal anywhere, except in the Pentagon, United States Pentagon. So then the spokesperson at the Pentagon was asked, well, what if the people don't believe this explanation? To which he responded, well, I guess we'll be back in another few years offering another one. Explanation number 5. And guess what number 5 is? It's all a myth. Nothing happened. In fact, Peter Jennings was the orchestrator of that, or at least he was assigned to promote that explanation. Nothing happened. Nothing crashed outside of Roswell. There was no press release. There was no special flight that went to Wright Field to test the material. There are no witnesses who were there in 1940s. It's all a myth. So you see how that's the final blow. The revision of history. It didn't even happen. You see how, an example, the parachute harness, the jumpsuit. How many of the Roswell witnesses you think were described having a parachute dangling behind them? Or even a harness? Of course not. But that's, again, what these crash dummies would have looked like. Looks alien to me. And what really bothers me when you think about the insult to everyone's intelligence, the idea that, as I said at the beginning, in even the revision of history, and the skeptics are the masters of this, because I tell you this is how it happened, because this is what I tell you to believe, and only because I tell you should you even believe it. That's the attitude in the States, because we tell you so. And that's exactly what they did with the project as far as skydive situation. Jay Leno, that very evening on The Tonight Show, went on in his opening monologue, how stupid do they think we are to believe this? And then Brian Williams at NBC News, who was the evening anchor of NBC News, the main NBC anchor on television at that time, And he's on the show at the end. And Leno brings it up once more, to which Brian Williams very stoically goes, Jay, what's it going to take for the American people to believe their government? How about the truth? But you see, the press, at least in the States once again, because they want to stay in business, they go right along. They repeat the lies. That's why we have the term fake news back in the States, because it's as though it's all we're hearing lately. And then the New York Times, wreckage of spaceship of this Earth in the United States. So we sent a fax to the Times. If we could present you a single witness to the actual bodies, a single first-hand witness to the real thing, would you retract this? And the editors got back to us and said, not only will we retract that, but we will retract the original 1947 balloon explanation. So we didn't send them one. We sent them 8. 8 first-hand witnesses to the bodies. They didn't live up to their bargain. I mentioned Peter Jennings. This was in 2005. To our primetime special. They spent 4 days filming with us in the field. They would not talk to a single witness. Dr. Edgar Mitchell was with us, one of the greatest heroes in American history, and they would not even talk to him because he was going to say something positive about Roswell. And then, as I said, Jennings in the Roswell segment, in the first minute, he uses the word myth 5 times. You want to take a break now, or are we about? Because we're going to take a little break. Yeah, we're going to take a break now, but I'm going to leave it on this because just to give you a little perspective of what we're talking about. The debris field, and then you see the trajectory line, and then how many of you are aware that there was a final impact site, a separate location, where the remains of a pod, a capsule, 2 bodies. 2 bodies at this site, 2.5 miles from the debris field, along the same route. And then, if that wasn't enough, there was a survivor, a live one, also recovered at the final impact site. So with that, we're going to take a little break, and we're going to get wound up. We're going to get even better in the next part. So, okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. If I may just indulge me for a second, if I may just put in a quick plug. We've had now 5 archaeological digs at the crash site. More accurately, the debris field, where all the wreckage was scattered. And we have found certain elements. We have confirmed certain things about the crash as described by the witnesses. And we're going back again next year. And I can't emphasize enough the expense involved. So I make the comment as far as that the books, whatever books I sell, go towards that effort. So keep that in mind, and that this way you also, I can honestly, you're part of that effort, that you could feel that, even by buying a book, that it helped as far as in our efforts to finally prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this did indeed happen back in 1947. So, I'm going to jump around again, because when Major Marcel back from the debris field. And again, those of you who know the story, what's the first thing he does before he heads to the base? 2 o'clock in the morning, he wakes up his wife, Vi, and his son, Jesse Jr., and takes them into the kitchen where he has all the debris that he brought into the house scattered on the floor. In 1990, May of 1990, we had Jess Marcel Jr., Dr. Colonel Jesse Marcel Jr., hypnotically regressed by the late Dr. John Watkins, who got the Hillside Strangler to confess under regression, under hypnosis. So we went right to the top. We took Jess Marcel, we wanted to take him back to that very night. Relive it in the first person. Now mind you, this is just 4 years after his father has passed away. And it was almost like professional resistance, doctor against doctor, because Jess Marcel was such a difficult subject. It took the better part of the day to finally get him back to that very early morning of July 8th, 1947. And he starts to describe handling the wreckage, seeing the symbology on the I-beams, and his father repeatedly stating flying saucer over and over again, flying saucer. Not once did he question what it was, and he certainly didn't suggest that it could be a weather balloon kite. And so when Dr. Watkins was bringing him out of the hypnosis, and this was in the presence of a film crew from NBC News. We were up in Helena, Montana, where Jess Marcel Jr. lived at that time. We did not anticipate, we had no idea that when he came out of the trance, and his father having just passed away 4 years earlier, he opens his eyes and the first thing he says is, "Dad? Dad?" And the tears start to stream down his face, and it's like, oh my God, we just caused him to lose his father all over again. But the point being, that's how real it was. He was there with his dad reliving that. And it just made it all the more solid. It just emphasized all the more that what happened that night, that early morning at the Marcel home on his way to the base with the first carload of wreckage was indeed a flying saucer, because that's all his father kept reciting over and over again. Flying saucer, flying saucer. So the staff meeting the next morning, they decide what they're going to do. They put out the press release at noon Central Standard Time in New Mexico, announcing they've captured a flying saucer. Marcel is on his way to Wright Field, so we talked earlier, for the testing and analysis of the debris. And they are diverted from that flight to then go to Fort Worth, where General Ramey is waiting with the reporters for the weather balloon press conference. Marcel had no idea that a weather balloon was packaged up and back in the bomb bay of the B-29, which was called Dave's Dream, because Marcel had a box of the real debris on his lap up in the cockpit. He goes to General Ramey's office. He places it on his desk. Ramey says, "I want to see where this happened." They go to a map room. They return back to the office. The real stuff is gone, and on the floor is the weather balloon. And Marcel was told, get down on your knees and pose with the stuff, and they take the two pictures. Now, General Ramey cancels the flight, the resumption of the flight to Wright Field. In fact, he announces to the press, I've just explained it. It's nothing more than a weather array, weather balloon kite. No need for it to be tested and analyzed. Except those who were involved, such as the FBI. This is the FBI Bureau Office in Dallas, Texas. 6:17 that evening. And it states, it describes what Ramey has just announced as nothing more than a hexagonal radar reflector kite. And then it goes on to say, but that telephonic conversation between their office at Wright Field, in other words, the FBI's office in Wright Field, had not borne out this belief. So in other words, the FBI was refuting the balloon explanation. And guess where the wreckage, the actual wreckage, went? It went on to Wright Field. Historic fact. So that in itself continues to demonstrate that this was much beyond what the government in the States was claiming it was. That this was way beyond a weather balloon. I mean, that is an official FBI document refuting the balloon explanation. And then we throw into the mix J. Edgar Hoover, handwritten note, just a few days later, July 15th, when he's asked if they would investigate the flying discs, the flying saucers. And he writes, I would do it, but before agreeing to it, we must insist upon full access to discs recovered. For instance, in the Southwest case, the Army grabbed it and would not let us have it for cursory examination. Hoover. Actual handwritten note from J. Edgar Hoover. And when he says the Southwest case, Southwest, as far as the United States, what case do we think he's talking about? Because this, again, is just a week after Roswell.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about the Ramey memo. How many have seen some of the actual enhancement and the linguistic efforts by the likes of Dr. David Rudiak, Dr. Donald Burleson, and their conviction, especially the main line which reads, the victims of the wreck you forwarded to the blank blank at Fort Worth, Texas. Now, what type of balloon has victims? Casualties, bodies. And yet, according to the optics metricians like Rudiak and Burleson, who have spent hours, weeks, years, Rudiak himself will have, because in 1990 we discovered that the actual negatives of these photographs still exist at the Bettman Archives Library in Texas. So we worked from actual enhanced scans from the negatives. They are better than the actual negatives. And Rudiak would take a digitized scan of the negative, blow it up onto a wall bigger than this screen, and then, as you see, even that's nothing more than just enlargement. You see, we're almost close enough. We're right on the cusp with the naked eye. And even the skeptics in the States agree, yes, victims of the wreck. Probably talking about it came down on somebody and it hurt them. Okay. Prove it. Because we can prove it didn't happen. We can prove that, first of all, in the American military, whether civilian or their own, they always use the word casualty. Civilian casualties, military casualties. The fact that they use the word victims, they are qualifying it for some reason. The fact that the use of the word disc is used twice in the memo. Why is it in parentheses? Because it wasn't shaped like a disc, but they were using the vernacular of the time, flying discs, flying saucers. Why do they qualify it? This still remains one of the greatest potential smoking guns we have. In fact, in the new History Channel series, we're going to try to up the ante. We're going to step it up even further. One of the things we proposed as far as to Rudiak and Burleson and then the producers at History. Now, the skeptics would say this is like faces in the clouds, to use that term, like a snowflake. Everyone is different. Well, how about the fact that there are only 26 letters in the alphabet? That's hardly faces in the clouds. And then they have to be actual words. And they have to be coherent. They have to make up coherent sentences. So you start to narrow the scope of possibility. So these aren't just random words. It actually has to make sense. The word victims, it only works based on the number of letters involved and the fact that when they are enhanced, it reads victims. So because to follow the same procedure that the military did with radar interpretation, that now they have computers that actually monitor all the radar screens at respective flight control centers back in the States. No more interpretation. We're going to propose that they design a computer program to interpret the Ramey memo. In other words, there are only 26 letters, there are only so many words that apply, and let's let a computer finally decide. What does it read? No more argument. And we're going to get the skeptics to say, we'll accept whatever it artificially determines, because we're willing to, as they would say, put our money on the line. We're that confident. Now you see again, this is just enlarged. And if you look close enough from here, you see the word disc. The victims of the wreck that you forwarded to the blank blank at Fort Worth, Texas. Again, what victims of a balloon crash? Doesn't say, I'll say it again, doesn't say spacemen or aliens, but we're left with no other possibility if we then tie it in with all the eyewitness testimony. And I like to believe that those of you in the back, it even reads sharper, clearer. Because then you have compression that you all know of the Shroud of Turin, right? The alleged burial cloth. And if you ever saw the History Channel documentary where they did the 3D imagery of the shroud, that was Studio Macbeth in New York, Ray Downing is the one who supervised that entire process. I know Ray very well because he helped me on the Ramey memo. And the same problem we have with the memo is the same problem they had with the shroud, is that the noise factor is enhanced as much as the signal. In the case of the shroud, the fabric is also exaggerated as much as the image. So they had to design a program that would slowly shave away the fabric, layer by layer, until nothing was left except the figure, the image. And he maintains that the same thing can be done with the memo, that we can design a program that will eliminate all the grain, all this background noise, until all we have left are the letters. That's where we presently are with the technology. And again, to the skeptics, if any of you were here tonight, I would say, you accept the final analysis, we accept the final analysis. And then if you're wrong, you admit you're wrong. So, exciting things. I mean, that's all, coming up in the next year. And we're to the point because the witnesses are all just about passed away. So now we have to hit on the debris, the documents, the memo, the archaeological digs. I'm hitting the button. Somebody's playing, Okay. We talked about this yesterday. Again, more documentation. Those are the staff officers at Roswell in 1947. Marcel, we interviewed Colonel Briley before he passed away. He was the one who told us that Colonel Blanchard didn't go on leave as he had announced to the press, but actually established a base of operation out at the crash site. That's where he was until the recovery effort had been completed. And then we found Colonel Patrick Saunders back in 47. He was the base adjutant, head of operations. And when I talked to him the first time, he just laughed and used the word Martians. Like, why are you even bothering? Why are you even looking into this? So, in 1992, before he died, no, excuse me, that was Easley. Saunders died in 1995. He actually had been up on a roof and he fell off of a ladder. And he hit his head. And so he would die sometime after that, but before he died, he bought up paperback copies of our second book. And he sent them out to his family, his best friends. That's the inner leaf, which reads damage control. And inside each one, Saunders wrote, "Here's the truth, and I still haven't told anybody anything. Pat." A signed deathbed confession. Because obviously our book is about what happened back in 47, and it's not about the recovery of a weather balloon. These are just some vintage pictures from 47. Arthur Osachuk was on the flight of the straight flush that went out on July 9th. It was the second body flight. We talked about that yesterday. We tracked down all his fellow crewmen, Lloyd Thompson, Felix Martucci, Robert Slusher, and they all described the crate, the wooden crate that was hidden in bomb pit number 1, that was loaded into the bomb bay. This is a full day after the balloon explanation. And they fly directly to Fort Worth with heavy guard inside the bomb bay. They arrive, they taxi up to the waiting officers, and Martucci, the bombardier, recognizes a mortician that he had gone to school with years before. Now, why would a mortician be waiting for this crate that was hidden where normally the atomic bomb would be kept, under heavy guard? And then when they resumed the flight, they returned back to Roswell, and he would make the comment, "Boys, we just made history." Now remember, I had also mentioned that Marcel was kept overnight at Fort Worth. This was the return flight he went back on. So you see, we're able to plug in as far as all these details, all the witnesses involved. And the way that Marcel just sat there, he was livid because he became the fall guy. He was the patsy who was ordered to pose with the substituted weather balloon, when he knew that this was, again, something, as he put it, not manufactured on this earth. There he is, and he's still alive. He's one of our surviving witnesses. He's in Florida. That was their aircraft that they flew, straight flush, B-29. I guess that's me standing with him. I think you can tell which one is which, right? So, Sergeant William Ennis was a flight engineer with the 393rd. They would talk about they could take the B-29, the silver plates, down apart down to the last rivet, put them back together again. Before he died, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Don, before I go, you have to find out how that damn thing flew. It didn't have a moving part on it." I think he knew what he was talking about, because that's exactly what all the other witnesses talk about. There wasn't a moving part on it. There he is before he died. See, it has nice teeth, though. Probably not his, but I can't emphasize enough. I miss all these guys. I made the comment yesterday that every time I go back to Roswell, and not that any of them were in Roswell, we had to track them down, but we always made every effort to bring them back. We'd have them flown back, and we'd take them to the old base. We'd take them out to the debris field. We'd have them walk around and say, "This is where I saw this is where I saw that, this is where that happened, this happened." And I go back now in 15 days. And each time I go back, as I say, it's a little more lonely. Everybody's gone. It's like you're losing your uncles over and over and over again. Because all these men had just come off of World War II. They were all heroes. They didn't need this. And they didn't need to have the world laughing at them. They didn't need to have the media constantly refer to them as UFO nuts, conspiracy buffs. I mean, it's a balloon, ladies and gentlemen. Why can't you accept that? Well, these were the people that all stood in defiance of that and said, "No, we were there. We held it in our very hands, and it was not made here." There's Asa Troop, and that's one of the displays at our museum. One of our digs, Roswell dig, and then the pictures. They hadn't seen each other since 1947. They spent the better part of 2 days together. It was wonderful. We have the base yearbook, so we were able to track down all these people. We could place them at the scene of the crime. One of them was Earl Fulford. There he is at the debris field with my partner Tom Carey. Fulford described to us that when they went out, now mind you, 60 troops spent 3 full days around the clock gathering up all the wreckage. That's some balloon. And Fulford talked about how he was on his hands and knees with a sack over his shoulder. And he would grab a piece, he would crumble it, and then he would stick it into the sack. And then he could feel it open up and start to jab him in the shoulder or in the back. So it was the memory material that kept stabbing him as it opened up. And it was like, how do I keep this stuff from, unraveling? Well, because again, it had its own mind. It knew what it was supposed to be, and it always returned back to it. George Hulk drove the flatbed, the lowboy, as it was called, of the pod down Main Street, Roswell, with the canvas tarp over the egg-shaped Volkswagen-sized craft that was at the impact site where two of the bodies and the survivor was recovered. He's gone too now. You would ask me who did what involved with this situation back and forth, and I could tell you exactly who they were. That's how precise. And not a one contradicts the other. Oh, no, I was on that flight. Oh, no. I talked about Enola Gay, boxcar, the 2 B-29s dropping the atomic bomb. You know how many men have claimed they were on those flights who were not? How many men through the years have claimed they were the pilots on those flights and they were not? Not the case with Roswell. Not a one that refutes the other. Again, it's as though they're all reading from the same script. Or it happened exactly as they witnessed it. They were there. I cite the example of the Kennedy assassination back in the States, or more recently, 9/11. For those of us back in the States, we remember exactly where we were, what we were doing, and what we immediately thought at the time those news stories broke. And we weren't there. I wasn't in Dealey Plaza when this happened. I wasn't in New York when the Twin Towers were hit. And I will remember for the rest of my life. And to think that any of these men would forget a single moment, and they were there, they were involved, of something so profound, so extraordinary that it was a wonder when they did talk to us. It was as though it happened yesterday. Even down to conversations that took place, words that were exchanged, because it's indelibly etched in their very psychic. And again, it remains an insult for anybody to suggest that these men, the women who were involved, couldn't identify an off-the-shelf weather balloon device. Artist's conception of the lowboy going down Main Street, Roswell. Well, why did it go down Main Street? Because it was the only way back to the base from the desert north of town. And then they would have proceeded down this drive into that very hangar, building P3, building 84. It's a B-29 hangar still there. That's where all the wreckage and the bodies transited through at the time of the incident. My partner, Tom, has a habit of photographing headstones. I guess it'd be no different than if you track down all the birth certificates of all the people involved. But for almost every witness we've talked to, now deceased, it's further confirmation that they did exist. In other words, we're putting names and even headstones behind all the witnesses involved. Last time I was with Earl, and we had him in Roswell, and he was pretty exhausted. We took him back to his motel, and we even helped him get into his bed. And he sat there in the bed, and all at once he started crying. And he said to us, you know, boys, you've made my dream come true. I came back home. And now that I've been here, I see that it all did happen. It wasn't just a dream. And thank you for believing me. I'm going to skip him because he drove one of the ambulance trucks. Because I'm going to skip that because that's from M Squad. Squadron, that was the medical unit. And they called him Tiny. His name was Erwin Fortman. And he drove one of the ambulance trucks. They came in through the south end of the base and brought in his case, they brought in 2 of the bodies. The gentleman to your left is Eleazar Benavides. He was with the 390th Air Material Command. They were assigned guard duty at Building P3, Building 84. They were then instructed to take a number of bodies over to the base hospital. And one of the men stepped on the sheet over one of the gurneys and it pulled free. While Benavides was standing there, he immediately saw the face and the eyes opened. His wife described to us, for the 40 years they were married before she died, they slept in separate rooms because he couldn't get over what he saw. He would jolt up in the middle of the night and scream out because he could not get the face out of his mind. First time we met with him, and thereafter, it took us 2 years to get him to finally talk to us. And when he did finally talk, he wept like a baby. And he kept going on and on, if you only saw what I saw, if you only saw what I saw. Another firsthand to the wreckage. He worked under Marcel in intelligence. Frederick Benthal was a military photographer who took the pictures of some of the bodies out at the crash site, and where he was then assigned after he returned back to Washington. That's one of his pictures. I'm going to jump because some of this is redundant from last night. Colonel Marion Magruder, Black Mac Magruder, triple ace World War II. Member of the War College, class of 47, 48. In April of 1948, they were assigned to Wright-Patterson, and they were shown the survivor. He gave a deathbed to his 5 sons in 1995, where he described that they were shown the crash survivor from Roswell when they were assigned at Wright-Pat in April of 1948. Air War College, class of 47, 48. There's Magruder. There's his assignment. April 48, temporary duty, Wright Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. Homer Rowlett, Master Sergeant, 603rd Air Transport Unit. The Air Transport Unit was primarily involved in the recovery operation at the time. Rowlett was scheduled for heart surgery around 1990. and he's lying on his gurney outside the OR. He waves his daughter. I thought we had her picture. I'm sorry. Carlene, over to his bedside. Now, mind you, he's been given very little chance for survival. He has already had numerous heart surgeries. He has massive heart disease. And while she's leaning over him, he tells her all about Roswell. And he was part of the recovery team. And he saw the wreckage. And he saw the craft. I saw the little men. And one of them was alive. Harvey Telesco, before he died, he was also with the 603rd. Confided to his wife, one of them survived the crash. I went through this. I want to jump to easily. Major Edwin Easley was the provost marshal at Roswell in 1947. He too retired a lieutenant colonel. When we tracked him down in 1990, we have him on tape. Now mind you, this is 43 years after the incident. And we have him on tape stating over and over again, I can't talk about it, I'm still sworn to secrecy. No matter what we asked him, can't talk about it, still sworn to secrecy. Our book came out. We sent him a copy. A few months later, we called him, asked him if he had read the book. You see which direction we're going. In wonderful military response, we ask, well, can you at least tell us if we're going in the right direction? To which he responds, well, let's just say you're not going in the wrong direction. And so 2 years later, he's dying of stomach cancer at Parkland Hospital. Same hospital that John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. And his granddaughter brings him a gift, holds it up to his face in the presence of his two daughters. I thought she was there too, I'm sorry. And he turns away and goes, oh, the creatures. And then he goes on to describe what had happened back in 47, how the president had asked them never to say another word about this. It was a copy of our second book that the granddaughter brought him. Oh, the creatures. I'm jumping again. I had mentioned the public information officer, First Lieutenant Walter Hott. He was the one who took the dictation of the very press release that they had captured the flying saucer and then hand-delivered it to the two newspapers, the two radio stations, where they announced that they had actually captured the real thing, the genuine article. For years, we tried to get Walter to talk. And little by little, he gave us little tidbits. One day I was sitting with him, and I went, Walter, because he always referred to Colonel Blanchard. And the two of them were best friends. In fact, when Blanchard, then a four-star general at the Pentagon, died, they didn't just send a letter, a telegram, make a phone call to inform Walter that General Blanchard had passed away. They sent a courier from Washington that went right to Walter's home in Roswell to inform him that General William Blanchard had just passed away. That's how close. So being that close, we just naturally assumed that the base commander, Blanchard, had to confide to him, had to show him, had to actually take him into his confidence as to what was happening out in the desert just north of town. And so for years, we struck out. We could not get Walter to budge, except for a little, as I said, tidbit, little morsel once in a while. One time I'm sitting with Walter as I was describing it all, and he always referred to Colonel Blanchard as the old man in true affection and respect. And I go, Walter, in the midst of a conversation, how tall did the old man say the bodies were? And his arm shoots out like that. So about where he was sitting, so about 4 feet from the floor. And he looks at me and it's like, you no good, I mean, you got me. And so I was constantly trying to get him to admit things, to acknowledge things, without breaking his oath. In fact, that's what it came down to. He had promised his best friend, as it turned out, William Blanchard, that he would never say another word about this. So you recall when I talked about Sheridan Cabot's son, Joe, trying to get him to write a sealed statement for posthumous release. That's exactly what we did with Walter Hott. He agreed that he would write a sealed statement. And we provided all the information he had given us, and we wrote it into a legal document. He read it over, not once, but 3 times. And it was witnessed, it was notarized, and he signed it. And it stayed locked and held in the possession of his family until he passed away. And then they turned it over to us. And we released it in our book, Witness to Roswell. The full statement, final statement of Walter G. Hott. The wreckage, the bodies, everything that had transpired on the base at that time, all described by the base commander's second man in charge. And again, from somebody who was there, somebody who held actual wreckage in his hands. And I'm going to close, and then we're going to have a Q&A, question and answer period for a short time. But Major Jesse Marcel, the patsy, the fog guy, who's ordered to pose with the weather balloon, and he's told at the time, just be a good soldier, Jess. It's all going to come out. 5 years. It's all going to come out. You'll be exonerated. You'll be a hero. 10 years pass. Just hold on, Jess. Be a good soldier. It's all going to come out. 15 years. 20 years. 25 years. 30 years later, he's finally dying of emphysema, and he realizes it's not coming out. But he comes out. And most of you who know Roswell know that he is one of the main witnesses to the entire event. And when Marcel goes public and he states to the world, quote, being familiar with all materials, both foreign and domestic, this was nothing made on this earth, end quote. That's all you need to know about Roswell. That's all anyone needs to know about Roswell, is that it was not made on this earth. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you, and then we'll have some questions and answers if you'd like. So, do we have any questions, any suggestions, any criticisms? I'm open to everything. So, yes, sir. And loud enough so everybody can hear.
Sure, no problem. I guess one thing that springs to mind for me, and I should state here and now, I'm not a skeptic. However, I suppose the one thing that jumps out at me is that the material that you described that couldn't be damaged with a sledgehammer, I kind of wonder then if that damage couldn't be inflicted like that, how come the craft came apart when
Exactly.
it hit the ground? That's my only question. Yeah.
We would all agree that our materials back in 1947 were probably down about here. We would all agree that in 2019, they're lighter and stronger, and we're probably up about here now. Anything that is manufactured that is malleable, if it can be put together, it can be taken apart. Everything has a fracture point, a stress point. If ours was down here in 47, and maybe today we're here, maybe theirs is up here. But whatever happened, whether it was struck by lightning or there was an internal malfunction, it reached that fracture point. It reached that, and it caused it to break up. So it's just applying our own, laws of physics. And so I hope that, yeah. That's why I say nearly indestructible, again, based on our technology. So,
and we don't know how fast it was going when it hit the ground. So
it actually was a mid-air explosion.
right.
Mid-air explosion. That's why it rained debris that covered almost a mile long.
Sure.
Yeah. So, good question.
The picture you see on,
Loud enough.
the picture you see on the internet about the autopsies is like
Oh, question of the alien autopsy. Complete hoax. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, when the stills were coming out, when the Brits were sending us stills for the Roswell witnesses, and we were showing them, and one by one, not even close, not even close. And then to actually see it, and there were all types of stage tricks that were done. And because I've consulted on TV and movies and that type of thing, whenever you're working with latex, for example, and you make it like a latex mannequin, a body, and if you were to make an incision on it, in a human incision, when you make it, it is a straight line. I mean, if the scalpel is straight and you make that incision, you make that cut, it makes a nice, even, straight line. With latex, it puckers, it waves. Every time they make an incision, for example, in that video, not film, video, the hand is in the foreground. So you can't see the actual incision being made. Again, that's a Hollywood trick. So it's things like that that they're staged. The breathing, as far as the decontamination outfits they're wearing. Back in 47, they were not self-contained. There would have been hoses and tubes coming out and then breathing tanks and boxes all around them. Well, these are self-contained back in 47. They didn't even exist. So it'd be wonderful. I mean, again, nobody would desire more greatly that something like that would be genuine. But when they're not, we can't resurrect them into something they're not. So, yes, ma'am.
Colonel Philip Corso.
Oh, question about Philip Corso.
And he's claimed that he was given all this stuff.
Yeah, the question that I knew Philip Corso. I interviewed him twice. Kind, gentle, most credible, believable witness. He didn't write the book. Doctor/attorney William Burns of New York wrote the book. In fact, the Corso family sued Burns after the book came out. They disputed its content and that a lot of it was basically fabricated. And when we learned that one of our witnesses who we had proven to be a fraud, forging documents, fabricating photographs and drawings, the late Frank Kaufman. And then when we learned that Corso, on 2 separate trips to Roswell, had stayed with Frank Kaufman. Now, why are you staying with a fraud? And then the opening chapter in The Day After Roswell, which is a summation of the Roswell incident, it is 100% Frank Kaufman. If I'm Philip Corso and I have my own story to tell, why am I relying on someone else to give me all the information? And then why a fraud on top of it? So I think he got caught up and they needed to fill in a lot of detail. Corso's claim that the material was all assimilating to the private sector, absolutely true. Because that's the government, again, / military doesn't manufacture anything. Ships, tanks, planes, that type of, all private. So he was absolutely correct about that. But we already talked about that in our book 5 years before that. Because we had our first-hand witnesses at Battelle Institute, Hughes Aircraft, General Electric, Bureau of Standards, Rand Corporation. So Corso was just corroborating what we already had publicized 5 years before. So, yes, sir.
Where were they from? Interdimensional beings like fallen angels or or demons? And what happened to the technology? Is the people they using now the technology they got from Roswell, like mobile phones and fiber optics and satellites and all that stuff?
I see very little evidence that they have reverse engineered anything. The one thing I mentioned, the fiber optics, is one possibility, but everything else, I question the human arrogance more and more. The thought that, remember in the movie Independence Day, and Will Smith, he's able to get right into the UFO and then pilot it and act like, oh yeah, we can figure this out because we're human beings and we're just as smart as any other species around, the universe. Again, the human arrogance that we would have something drop in our laps and we'd immediately be able to plug it in and make it work. And to me, it's tantamount to taking that projector, sending it back in time in the Middle Ages, and they'd be able to figure it out. We're here and they're up there, and we can bridge that gap? No. No. And that's why I still maintain, as I described yesterday, it's a cover-up of ignorance. We still have no answers. That's why they haven't disclosed this in all this time, because they're just as much in the dark as we are. I've had high-ranking officers tell me that we don't know where they're from, who they are, and what their agenda is. So what do they disclose? We're still driving cars with internal combustion engines. We're still flying jets, rockets. We're talking 100-year-old technology. Where are the big breakthroughs? I hope someday, and maybe someday they will crack some of the code, so to speak. But for the moment, I see very little evidence of that. So.
I think, here on Earth, we can't explain most of the ancient megalithic engineering.
As well.
Right here on our
Right here, right under our noses.
Anything from anywhere else.
Exactly, exactly so.
I know that there's been a push over the years to have some of these elderly gentlemen released from their security oaths and that sort of stuff. Any headway been made with that at
They're
all?
gone. That's the problem.
Okay.
Yeah. And as I described, the Pentagon spokesperson saying, well, if the people don't believe the crash dummy explanation, then we'll be back with another one in a few years. As I said, it's running out the clock.
Sure.
Stalling for time.
The case with Roswell, but as the years go by with things that happened in the 50s and the 60s, with those sort of witnesses,
Those of us watching the situation with the Navy, the U.S. Navy, supposedly giving clearance to their own pilots with coming forward with their UFO encounters. They forget it's called JNAP 146. It's Joint Army Navy Air Force Procedure. And it reads, disclosure of any classified UFO information outside of respective ranks is forfeiture of all pension and benefits, $10,000 fine, and or 10 years imprisonment. And I checked, and it is still in effect with the Navy. So why did they tell us one thing when JNAP 146 is still active over their own pilots? So that's another reason we're being very cautious of what's going on with this present disclosure situation back in the States. Because for having been with Dr. Hynek, and then what even happened with us a number of times, been there, done it, and it never happened. Hynek, it happened on 2 occasions with presidents, Ford, and then Carter. Didn't happen. We don't even have a president involved right now, and everybody's jumping up and down. Oh, disclosure is imminent. It's going to happen any day now. Again, sorry. We've been a lot closer than we are now. And it didn't happen before, and hopefully in your lifetimes, not in mine. No, no. Yes?
Just wondering about the survivor. Have you interviewed anybody who's spent some quality time with the survivor, like to know, like, what does he eat, what does he breathe? Is he a he?
Question about a survivor, and we had any witnesses who actually spent time studying, researching the survivor. A lot of rumors. The closest we had, there was a linguist, and we tracked down 3 witnesses to the linguist, and as it turns out, she was confiding to other linguists about being called in the right pat, and that she was working with what she called a new species. And the thought and the project being try to communicate. Now, I mean, certainly they would have done everything they could, especially with a unique species, and they would preserve a unique a specimen of that sort. But just imagine those reports, just imagine those files. And if we had anything to do with its demise, because according to Magruder, who confessed to seeing the survivor at Wright Pat in April of '48, it was their information that had died shortly thereafter. I mean, how often do you prod and stick something before it finally just, yeah.
I assume if it survived, it breathed out air, and they must have fed it something, or maybe it didn't eat as we...
We can only surmise.
Yeah, okay.
We can only surmise. But I have to go by, again, the eyewitness testimony and the information and documentation we have. Last question.
Have you had any pressure put on you to remain, not sort of talk about what you're talking about, and how frequent has that been?
Absolutely, good question. Absolutely, good question. We had our very first press conference in Chicago in June of 1990. We had a room full of 50 reporters. A question came up. And the first thing we demonstrated was we felt the best way to protect ourselves was to shine as much light on the investigation as possible, and then convey that over to the witnesses as well. As long as you remain in the shadows, if something happens to you, no one's going to know any different. Nobody will put 2 and 2 together. So we've always been very public, very visible as far as our activities. Second thing was we had a prepared statement where we said, we announced if they would like to pay us a visit, they know where we live. They can pay us a visit anytime they like, but they better send their best because that's what it's going to take. So in other words, we were right in their face. Basically, if you want to, come and pay us a visit. So, and here I stand. Now I have a long flight home, so don't give anybody any ideas. So with that, I thank you again. If anybody's interested in the books or anything, I'm here to sign them. And thank you for having me. Thank you for being here this evening. And I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed yourself. So thank you.